Welcome to another episode of the Eviltester Show. And tonight's episode is all about practicing, and we have a special guest star, Mr. James Lyndsay. We're going to chat about what does it mean to practice, how do we practice, how do we come up with exercises, because James has got a tremendous amount of exercises and tools and software to practice with on his website, workroom-productions.com. So let's get started. So at this point, I feel like Joe Rogan because this is the first time we've had anyone else on this show. Look, I even call it show. It's like it's a big thing. And also, I said first time we have had it on because it's just me, but I think in like those terms. So we've got James Lyndsay, and we have worked together in the past doing actual testing and software development stuff, and we've done training. And a lot of those training sessions were built around practice exercises. Because one of the themes for today is practicing. Because we did that through the Black Ops testing
Yeah,
with Tony Bruce and Steve Green.
yeah, that was a fun thing. We had real software and real testers, and we really tested the real software, and then we went into teams and we went into public things and said, "This is how we tested it. How would you test it?" And then we gave them the same thing at the same state as we had it, with some of the same data and some of the same tools, and showed off our notes, and it was as real as one can make it, I guess.
Yeah, that was a fun thing to do because we tested the apps first, and we all have different styles of testing. So,
Wildly
uh,
different.
so that was quite good. And then from that, we deconstructed our notes into exercises and hints and suggestions and prompts.
Hmm.
And is that how you approach you? Because one of the things we should mention, you are doing online practice sessions where people can come and practice stuff. And do you want to talk a little bit about those in a free format fashion?
Well, I'd love to, yes. I do 15 minutes once a week, most weeks for, well, currently people who subscribe to my website. And that involves typically an exercise, not a lecture, not a thing we say, this is what you should do, and this is what we can do, and this is what I have done. It's like, well, now here's a thing to play with, and we play, and then we talk. So the talking happens after the activity, and it's very short. Often the talking lasts longer than the activity. Often it lasts longer than the 15 minutes. And the idea there is that I think that if I look back on what I've done, it's often had people doing testing in it. I mean, that's what the test lab was about. That's what my exploratory testing workshops were about. There were always things to test. And I think that we continuously learn from what we're doing, particularly if we're learning with other people, and particularly, weirdly enough, if we're slightly outside our work. So that's what that little thing serves to do. It serves to make me actually make the exercises, but it also gives the world these things to play with, and it gives subscribers an opportunity to come and play with me and play with each other, which is lovely.
Yeah, so you mentioned the test lab.
Yeah,
So we should probably say what that is, just in case people have never
should.
been to one. So the test lab was you were given an area in a conference.
Mhm.
And I don't know if they told you what you were allowed to do in it or not, but you essentially had lots of machines and servers and
Yeah.
toys and whatever else. And did you have themes or did people just turn up and do whatever they wanted?
Well, we didn't have themes. I mean, the first thing we had was an idea. Bart and I hadn't met, and the idea appeared in between us maybe 5 minutes into the conversation. And the idea was that a testing conference needs a place for people to test. And that turned into a business plan within a few days. And the business plan went to the conference that we knew would listen to us, and that was Eurostar, who've been very accommodating with these things. And they didn't particularly give us many constraints. What they said was, yes, you can have a room, and that can be funded. Be funded in this way. We'd like you to involve sponsorship partners because it's something that they can sell. That's part of our plan. But we don't really mind what people do. We do want you, they said, being a conference, we do want you to not trash the other tracks, please. You know, yeah, fair enough. But that said, they were very helpful in that they gave us access to everybody who was on the sponsorship on the booth floor, and everybody who was speaking was people we could communicate with via them. So we could say, if you, as a speaker, don't just want to speak about what you're doing. But if you want to bring them into our lab, we will set things up for you. We will make sure that we have software that your technique works with or that your tool works with. We said the same to vendors. And we were occasionally met with a resounding silence. There were two or three sponsors who were fabulously engaging, but and many people who were fabulously engaging. But often we'd write to all the speakers, and all the speakers, go, oh, Christ, I can't do that. But occasionally one would get absolutely inspired and arrive Pied Piper like into the test lab. So the test lab was an idea for one conference that turned into a good enough idea that other conferences wanted it. So Bart and I took a little bit of time to go to the conferences we knew, and we had a lovely time. And people changed the format of that. It's a very different thing now. But yeah, have the organisers ever told us what to do? Not exactly. They've said, please don't do things. One organiser, Agile Testing Days, went as far as to say, we don't want you to do a test lab, we want you to do a build anything lab. And they gave us power tools.
That sounds
Presumably,
dangerous.
yeah, I was going to say, presumably some insurance somewhere and some very thick floor covering. And we got on over kind of 3 days with sawing things up and drilling things and making stuff that worked together. So making a thing that worked, but working with other things. So yes, it's not that they've ever particularly said what we should do. Occasionally they ask us to extend.
Yeah, because I remember going
Lovely.
to it quite a few times. Because Let's Test
Yeah,
had it. I've been
late
to a
night
Eurostar a few
virtual
times.
one. Yeah,
And then Agile Testing Days, you mentioned that it's been taken over to American conferences as well.
yeah.
And it was different every time. And it looked like too much work. So I never really got involved in it. But I'd quite happily turn up.
Yeah.
And
I've loved it.
that's where we used to hang out most of the time. If you weren't in the actual talks, or you weren't in what is it, the hallway track, you were in the test lab.
Yeah, well, occasionally it would get scooted away to the side of a conference, and then you'd find that people would go there, and if they could find it, and then they wouldn't leave. So and I think that a place to actually practice, a place to do testing, is a very attractive thing. We've tried it online, and I think it works better in person because so maybe what I ought to say is that people to test with is a very attractive thing. I think that's
That's
different,
true.
so the business of working on one's own and doing a bit of testing and doing an exercise is lovely, and indeed working online is lovely. But actually sitting there and seeing people going, "What is that?" That's a very smashing thing. And what is, I think, fascinating is where you get it's a very peer situation in a test lab where you get people who may have been standing on stage saying, this is how you do it, and they come in and they actually say, this is how we're going to do it. So you get people who've been testing for 6 months sitting next to people who've been testing for 40 years, and they've got very different approaches, and
Yeah.
they're genuinely learning from each other because that's what happens if you practice together. You always learn from other people.
Yep. And then you got people who only test on stage by talking about it and never come into the test lab.
Yes, there are test lab avoiders. I mean,
But, but it's an interesting point because when I think of practicing testing, I generally think about it as practicing my own. But then when I think about practicing other things, it's not always on your own. Like if you're practicing, so if I'm practicing guitar now, I'm on my own. But it used to be you practice in the band.
yep, yep.
Um, you practice singing
Mhm.
in choir.
Well, I do, yeah, and I mean, from that, I think there's a difference between practicing and rehearsing. And practicing is often quite a solo thing. So I will scarily occasionally walk down to the park and have a sing if I need to sing very loud and outdoors and not in the same building as my wife, who is the musical director of the choir and will undoubtedly tell me when I'm pronouncing the words wrong or singing in seven and a bit rather than in seven. So yeah, practicing on my own is handy, but rehearsing and practicing they feel like different things. Practicing is a bit maybe a bit more free form. Maybe if you've got a talk to do, you're practicing lots of different words in your head. But rehearsing, you're going to do it all in a row. Rehearsing with the choir, you certainly rehearse together because it's this weird egoless monster that turns up where everybody's just listening to each other and trying to make something that's much bigger than they are individually. So that's kind of different. But yeah, I guess practicing alone alone is definitely part of practicing, but when you see people practicing together, they get lots more. And I think it's the freedom of practicing. We go, I don't really care if this works or it doesn't, but there's something interesting I really want to try here, something strange, something unusual. But oddly, I've had a strange experience just today. I'm making a little event-driven thing. I'm making it with JavaScript. I'm learning about how to do that and learning about the patterns that I could use for that because I'm asking an AI to look at my code. And it's very cheap to write.
What does it say?
It generally says this is bollocks and you need to do something. This is not great. And sometimes it only gives you the obvious thing after you've made the obvious error. And the specific example is so if you've got an event-driven thing, you've got uh, listeners and emitters. So your emitters are sending events, listeners are listening for events. And I had a whole bunch of objects and they were merrily listening to things and other things were merrily emitting, and that was all fine. And I thought, right, well, this is a simulation, so it needs to happen more than once. So I cleared all the old objects out and put new ones in, and everything went pear-shaped because when I cleared the old objects out, I hadn't cleared out their listeners properly. And what is going on here? What is going on here? And I asked myself questions, and I asked the code questions, and I asked the AI questions. And the AI, what's wrong with this? The AI didn't ever tell me because they're not like that. But when I put something in that said, rather than looking up on the internet what happens with event-driven programming in JavaScript, I asked the AI, I said, when I delete an object, do I need to delete its event handlers as well? Yes, it said, and gave me paragraphs on it. And I thought, this was a really good learning experience because I was very open to learning at that moment, having failed, and then I got the precise answer. Probably not precise, probably felt precise. I got the answer I needed to teach me. So whereas you cannot trust what you're being told, occasionally the business of dialogue with an AI, just like the business of if you and I sat down, as we have done and tested things, we occasionally have a chat about what we're doing and go, what is this? And that's a very useful process for having the mind work. And hey, I found that with an AI today. So maybe practice is going to change now that we can ask stupid things, stupid questions, and they don't get fed up with us.
So it's I so I've never used AI in any of my practice sessions.
Mm,
But I'm trying to think of ways to use it. That's it's not to me not an obvious thing for me to do, but
mm,
it's interesting because when I'm practicing, I do make a lot of notes.
mm.
So there's no reason why I wouldn't make those notes into a chat system and like just turn it to prompt to say, "What do you think?"
I think to think that you're doing it for yourself and occasionally be able to turn around something that's got all the context and say, what's actually happening here is a really good little twist in perspective sometimes. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
but that's interesting. So you've got the concept of practicing, you've got the concept of rehearsing, and you've also got the concept of learning.
Mm,
So I practice in order to get better at something, which means I'm
mm.
essentially trying to learn how to do something better or learn have that kind of moment of something new pops out that you can then travel that path and pursue. So you're learning new things that you can also do.
So there's improving in the one sense and revealing in another sense. Improving, you tend to know what you've got. Revealing, goes, hey, there's an new opportunity over here. Right.
Yeah.
What does improvement look like for you? I mean, what do you have you got specific things that you practice for?
So it depends what I'm practicing. If I'm practicing guitar, then there's specific improvements on I want to improve like at the moment I'm working on my pinky strength. So I'm trying to get my
Mm,
pinky better. But if I'm looking at testing, um, sometimes I'm looking at how to use a tool better. Sometimes I'm looking at am I having the coverage that I want? Do I understand the web technology enough to spot the problems
mm.
and know why it's a problem or what to look at? Um, and a lot of it is going down the same path that we've gone through because all the web systems have the same thing. But sometimes you'll see something go, I don't understand that. I don't know what
Mm,
I'm looking at. And then you have to go and try and figure it out. And then you create entire practice sessions just around how can I explore this concept? What does it
mhm.
mean? Where does it appear? Which systems does it come in?
Do you find yourself writing a little tiny thing, a throwaway thing, in order to understand it?
Most of my things are not throwaway. They're
Yeah.
too big. But yeah, I do. Um, so I do write stuff in order to explore things.
Yeah.
I look for other people's software as well to explore things. Because when people create lots of testing applications, I've created lots of testing applications, then you find other people have created lots of testing applications. And what's great is we all accidentally put bugs in them. Like we don't know they're necessarily
Yeah.
there. Some are designed to have bugs. And so you know that there's bugs there. And the hard part is trying to find them because you don't want to embarrass yourself by not finding the most obvious bugs. You make hard ones with the black box puzzles.
Yeah.
Um, I find though my brain doesn't work like that. It's really interesting.
So people say they're hard. People say I've tried to actually tune them. Generally what I mean, of course, I tried to tune them. So the black box puzzles are they're little things with lights and buttons generally. To such an extent are they little things with lights and buttons that my friends in Altom in Romania built some actual boxes with lights and buttons, which were very entertaining to play with on the same designs. Now, software makes it easier to iterate. And generally, what I'm doing with a puzzle is I'm trying to put something together that is obvious when you know the answer. So, like a crossword clue, you know how it is. Generally, a cryptic crossword clue is in some ways easier than not a cryptic one because it's got both. It's got the answers in twice. They're all puns of some sort or another. And the same with the black boxes. I try to make it so that when you get the right idea, you go, of course that's it. That moment of revelation is what I'm working towards. And so people talk about them as if they're testing machines, and they're not really testing machines because I never say this is what it does it do it? There's no judgment of the thing. What you are instead saying is I've got a model. I'm making this model of what I think this thing is doing. Now I'm going to test my model by making experiments that I can do in the real world. And the more those experiments are borne out by the model, or the more indeed my observations, which are experiments I've done, are borne out by the model, the better I feel about the model. So that sense of reinforcing and revelation, and occasionally terribly destructive sense of, oh, I've been so wrong. I was looking for a bug today. Today I was looking for a bug, and the bug was that it's not that I had my debugger on or sorry, not that the bug was in the code. It was that I'd left a breakpoint in my debugger, but the way that my Kit was presenting the thing to me was with either a bare URL or with a numeric URL, and the debugger was on for the numeric one, but not for the bare one, and I got confused. So that my machine kept stopping, and that's that revelation of, oh God, it's not a queue. I've been modeling it as a queue, but actually it's a sequence. That thing really, I think, turns people on in terms of when that revelation happens. They get a lot of positive feelings, and that they carry that lesson with them. So I built a few, partly after a train conversation with you, coming back from a deeply dismal meeting about exams in Swindon.
Yeah.
So yeah, we built a few and took them to the States, and people going, but these are great fun to play with. And I think that for some people, they give this positive response to what they're doing because in a generally about 10 minutes you can have a fairly complete set of observations of most of them, in fact to such an extent that you go, is this surely this isn't all, and you have to dig into it in different ways. Some people really like them because it gives you that background. Other people often go in different directions with them. And a fine tester that you and I both know buggered off for about 2.5 hours with one of them, and then came back and called me very rude words with enormous delight. And another one went off for 4 separate 10-minute sessions, and he said, I keep making it more complicated than it is. I've got 4 complicated models, and it's none of them. So I've got to go. So that revelation is something that people have liked, and yeah, I think so. Yeah, Anna Meta Haas said these aren't for testing, and I quite agreed with her because they're not. They're for checking your own models and how your own model works, and a lot of exploration is about that. And so it's fun to practice exploration on those kind of things. I'm not sure it's fun to practice testing because What are you judging them against? I don't know. And if you're not
Yeah, and also
judging,
you don't have a huge
honest.
range of tools that you can use on it.
No, I mean
Although I
they're
saw that you
web
had
pages.
one that uses some sort of mad MIDI thing. What was that called?
Oh, yeah. This
Because
isn't
I,
going to work. This isn't going to work on audio, so I have to do this. And for
yeah,
those,
but what's it called? It's got an odd
this
name.
is a
It's
MIDI fighter twister.
That was it. It was the MIDI fighter twister.
Yeah,
And it's
well,
like, I'm not sure how many people have got that. I want to use it in
just me.
Doom and see how it worked for that. Why is it a fighter twister?
I don't. Well, this is the MIDI fighter, and the MIDI fighter twister has got knobs on. So you twiddle them. But this MIDI fighter responds to it's like a joystick. So it's
I
got a
see.
direction sensor and
It's
an
got a
accelerometer.
gyroscopy
Yeah,
in space moving things
yeah.
around thing.
And
Okay.
so those quite a lot of those puzzles have got a MIDI interface that is completely hidden.
Well, that's again, that's good for a test lab where you can
Yeah,
take that along and have
yeah,
people experiment with it.
yeah,
But the
absolutely.
concept of modeling in there is
Hmm,
really interesting because if you've got a model and you've got gaps in your model, you can do some practicing to fill those gaps.
mhm.
I mean, because a lot of things, so I've got the API challenges site,
Yeah,
which has, I think, 40 or 50 challenges that
fabulous
are
thing.
there
Yeah.
to do. And it's designed that as you work through the challenges, you build up a model of how APIs work. And so
Ah.
then when you come to test something else, you've already got an entire model. You know how to
Hmm,
explore it in the tools, you know why you would want to check that out on something. So rather than give people, here's a list of things that you can test an API,
hmm,
it's that leads you to building your own model. And some people will think, well, there's important bits in there, there's less important bits, but it's learning which parts are important and which are
hmm.
not. So,
Well,
because it's more that I find that when people sit down to test an application very often or practice with an application, they don't know what to do.
yeah, yeah, I agree with you. They well, they either they don't know what to do or they do know what to do in a restricted way. So there's somebody, maybe they're still in testing, I don't know, but I sat with them for maybe 3 months, and what they mostly did was put long strings in.
Okay. But that might be valid. There might be lots of different ways of doing long strings.
There's certainly revealed problems, and the application as it shipped certainly didn't display many problems with long strings. Plenty of null pointer exceptions, but long strings it was fine with. I think that it isn't just that people don't know what to do; they do know what to do, but there's a limited set of things they can do. And that weirdly enough, because I mean, you and I are both consultants. We both do several clients, and both through consulting, where we've often got small groups that are working together, and you're seeing different groups in different weeks, because you're in company A in one week and company B in the next week. But also from teaching public classes, it's really clear when you teach people to test, not teach people to follow this algorithm of testing, like a decision diagram, but you teach people to test, as in you're going to look for trouble. You're going to look for it in these ways, but though that you're going to find what trouble you can. Here are ways you can use. You're going to find your own ways. Then people have got a style, and even within teams where people have worked together for a long time, you can still find moments where they go, Jesus, how did you do that? Or what are you thinking? There's an exercise that I ran. Well, I run it from time to time, but I first ran it at a company called Metadata, I think, called What Can I Learn by Testing with You, which was, I mean, it's a table exercise. You get a group of people around a table, you give them something to test. It doesn't really matter what, but what you insist on is that people are talking to each other about what the testing is. And then you debrief at the end, or you debrief halfway through by saying, so I'm not interested in what you tested and what you found, and you make sure people are aware of that up front. But I want to know what you learnt from other people on the team. It's a very celebratory workshop. And all the time, people are saying, didn't know that was possible with our product. Didn't know that was possible in our environment. And these people have sat together for years, and sometimes, clearly not. But I love that. I just think it's fabulous when you get it to work. You get to see people going, I've been stuck in this way of doing it, and now I'm not as stuck as I was. And that revelation is a really important, powerful thing.
So what's interesting about that is we know that everything is built from the models that we have and then how we pursue those models. And some people, when they're getting started, if they're constrained, their model might be the things that you can do rather than the reasons for understanding the reasons why they exist and
Hmm.
generalizing back from those. And I did, some people only have one type of model, like and they don't overlap their models. They don't then see conflicts between the models, or they
Hmm.
pursue one model at a time completely in isolation. Because I think testers have to, unfortunately, handle cognitive dissonance well, because we have to have multiple models in our head at the same time that are potentially conflicting,
Yeah.
and then I try and focus in on those conflicts.
And well, in fact, you kind of feel them. I've always felt you have several things in your mind that can be simultaneously true, but if they're simultaneously true about the same thing, then one of them is wrong in some way or another, and you can feel that. It isn't a physical feeling, but I think you can get that, and it's in the same way that often jokes and indeed horror movies work because something is and something isn't at the same time. That's very much how testing works for me. Have got several things in my mind that should be the same and they're not the same. And I'm finding out where they're different. And I think that's a fascinating thing to do. And for me, part of the practice of testing is to encourage, is to have that feeling and to inspect that feeling. So, I mean, you and I both, we've both had times where we've been talking and thinking and working on data and the data side of testing and what it is to test data, what it is to build test data, but to test data itself. And I think it's when I talk to people who are keen on automating what the actions of a system are or what the actions of a user are, that sense of data, how data flows through a system, where data lives, where it isn't, where you've got two sets of data and then you've immediately got a potential for conflict, or where you've got a single source of data and that then is a bottleneck. Though that sense of data is something that when it's missing from a tester, the tester isn't going to go those ways. And there's
And
undoubtedly more that I don't have. So.
well, no, it's interesting because sometimes when you're in certain roles, you're forced to think in certain ways. Because
Mm,
if, particularly if you're automating and you're told if your like path takes more than 30 seconds to run, it's too big. So
right.
you can't have these long running executions through a system. And people often don't know how to make their automated execution robust.
Yeah.
So they don't know how so they'll make it wait for a certain period of time, but sometimes it takes longer. Or
Mhm.
the clue that they need to tell them to move on, they haven't synchronized on that. They've synchronized on something else that only happens under specific circumstances. So automating in such a way that it allows you to do those longer flows through the front end can be quite hard. So what they end up doing is picking the small chunk of flow and then going, what do I need to set up to allow me to jump into this flow and
Mhm.
then do it? Which also, so they kind of know partly the data flow, but it bypasses a lot of the mutations that can happen along the way.
Yes.
So they don't find the actual problems involved in that flow because they've shortcut it and they're looking at a certain part.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, I
again,
mean,
that comes back to the models that you're using.
I think there are a lot of tests like that where the variation is in the test, not in the setup. And
And again, that's also partly what you're taught uh, when you learn to automate things, because you're often using a unit test harness, and
Mm.
unit test harnesses focus on a very small subset of data because they're testing a very small
Yeah.
subset of things. And many people do not use parameterized unit tests.
Mhm.
So they're used to not feeding in lots of data to these small chunks.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I don't, in some ways, I quite like it when I come across non-parameterized unit tests because they're mine. Because you go, oh, that's handy. Somebody's already written a bit of this. I think I can just feed data in the top. And
Yep.
and then you see what comes out the bottom, and maybe it's weird, and maybe it's not. Maybe you don't know what weird looks like, but by the time you've fed a lot in the top, you have and seen what comes out the bottom. You start to get an aesthetic. You can't start to get a sense of what is good and what is bad. And indeed, you can usually refine it down. You go, well, this is obviously fine, and this is obviously unknown I need to talk to somebody about. And this is obviously fine-ish. Should it ever do that? So yeah, you get a sense of what's good and what's not. I think that now we've got a lot of LLMs that are generating you ask an LLM for a little thing, it generates you a big thing. The more for LLMs and for any AI that generates loads, that development of an aesthetic is absolutely where we're going to have to be with testing. And you don't, if you're going to develop an aesthetic, that's a mind judgment. That's something you've got to grow and consciously grow. I don't see that that's possible without playing with it and without practicing. I think we're all much better at spotting what feels like AI generated content or what feels like AI generated pictures now that we've seen a lot more of them. And I expect that'll continue. But if what we're being asked to do is to, for instance, judge the quality of an AI generated system or AI generated code, we have to practice at that, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things you see, you mentioned earlier that when people come in to test things, they target with a specific set of techniques that they know.
They may
And
do, yeah.
I'm wondering if that's because they haven't given themselves the permission to play with software in
Mm.
multiple ways, that they get fixed on this is the only thing that I'm really allowed to do.
Well, yeah, I mean, partly that's a question of budget because when you get told we don't have enough time and we don't have enough money, just do what you've been asked to do and stop playing. You kind of do. I
I wonder if there's a
think that's a
sorry, all right. So I
you're
mean,
right.
there's
Yeah.
two things in your background that I wanted to focus on. One was physics, and the other was not that
Yeah.
background, the fencing. You
Oh,
used to fence,
I
didn't you?
did. I did. Yes.
What did you do? Foil, saber, epi?
I was terrible at epee, so I fenced saber because it's very enjoyable. The
Right.
blade makes a big swish.
So I
Um,
did saber once,
yeah.
and I think, and I broke the saber. So I never did it again. I think in my head I had imagined I was wielding a claymore and trying to cut someone in half, and that's not saber. That's not what you do for saber.
No, no, really isn't. No. So for those who don't know, a saber is when you hit somebody with a saber with the edge or the point, you get a point. And when you hit somebody with a foil with the edge, you don't get a point. You only get a point with foil when you hit them with the point.
So I used to do epi,
Mm,
and the reason I did epi was that there was no real rules
no,
with
no,
foil. Because foil, I do foil, right? And
yeah.
someone would stick their arm out, and it'd be
Mhm.
straight, and it's like if I hit if I hit them, I still don't get a point. But it's like, but I
Yeah,
just killed them. No, no, you
yeah,
have to hit their sword first. It's like, no, I don't. I should just kill them. So that's
yeah.
why I went for epi,
Well,
because
Epe's
then
got a whole body target,
yes,
and yeah, and foil that you don't have any points on the mask or on the below the waist, and it just
no.
yeah,
But there's no rules in epi. It's basically if you hit, you get a point. If you hit
yeah,
at the same time, you both get a point. That was perfect for me. It was that. How can you explore the situation? So
yeah.
I so I wonder if people constrain themselves with the rules. Like Saber has fewer rules than
Yes,
foil.
yeah. Foil's very ruly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and
I
then
just
also
imagine that a lot of testers get stuck in foil mode and like they have to do things in a certain way.
very neatly put. Yeah, I think so. My specific example for that is where you are in a class and you give somebody your silly puzzle and they just press the buttons and some other bugger has flipped the code open and has looked at all the labels in your HTML and is working out what things do and person A goes, but that's cheating, and you go, that's the trick. That word, it's cheating. You've got to rule too many. It's okay to feel that going beyond the rules is cheating, but perhaps these rules don't apply here. Just like with epee, and where the whole body is the target. Not sure about having to hit the sword before you. Anyway, sorry, epee and foil rules. But I think people do get stuck into this is what we have to do, particularly two approaches. One is that I need to know what my expectations are before I can judge it. I think that's not great because as soon as you go, I may be wrong, but I can feel when it's wrong. And that judgment is mine to own. And yes, it's not definitive, but it's still my judgment, and I can look in on that. So you need to be able to get away from that sense of expectations. But the other one that really gets me stuck is I can't test until I know what it's for. And
Okay.
sorry, I can't explore it till I know what it's for. Maybe you can't test it, maybe you can't judge it, but the number of times that the first thing that happens, because people are taught this, have a play with this and think about what it does. And the question comes back always from the floor, what's it for? Well, tonight, Bob, it's for playing with. It's an exercise. We are not at work. But it's that's a fascinating thing to me. That sense of I can't even touch it until I know what it's for is definitely a rule that's come out of somewhere, sometime. And I wish I knew why, because it stops us. It stops us. It gives us too much reverence in some ways for these bits of crap that are full of bugs. Um, you
Well,
know,
it's that validation and verification thing, isn't it? You need to know what it's supposed to do before you
yeah,
you do it. And it's
yeah.
whereas the whole concept of exploration and experimentation is to
Mhm.
help try and free people from that.
Yeah, yeah, work out what it's not just does it do the right thing or has it been built in the right way? It is what can it do? It's full, these things are full of libraries. They've got
Yep.
lots of permissions. They can do things. Yeah, apparently, not apparently. I now run my LLMs in relatively small boxes. The reason for that is that if anybody compromises the thing that I'm asking for code, then they've got access to run code on my machine, haven't they? So it's that I think that well, for starters, verification and validation always wound me up because it sounds very reasonable. It sounds like those two together, because they rhyme and they're close together, sounds like that actually should be the whole world for some reason. Um, just like exploration and experimentation. And yet you talk to people and then these things become opposites because they fill the whole world. And then you talk to people in different organizations or different teams in different organizations, and half the people, that's a bit much. Often the definitions are so different for verification and validation between teams that what one team says is verification is validation in the other team, and and vice versa. Nobody
Yep.
understands each other, and still nobody's looking for trouble.
Yep. See, and from my entire life, I've gone out of the way to look for trouble,
Yeah.
and it's it's not been beneficial in a lot of instances. But
Well, if you,
I
if you put it, under what circumstances does this commercial organization want to look for trouble? Well, lots of commercial organizations don't want to look for trouble.
yeah, it's bad for your career very
Yeah,
often if you
absolutely.
look for trouble and
Yeah.
point it out.
Yeah, bad for you, bad for you where you are in the market. Yeah, we've looked for trouble a lot in our product. Have you? Yeah.
So
So,
you've also got a physics background. I
I do.
dug this out my bookcase. I don't know if you've read this one. The Art of Scientific Investigation
Oh,
by
no.
W.I.B. Beveridge, published in 1955.
His name is Beveridge.
Beveridge. So out of
That's a
all
word from
the
the past.
scientific
Yeah.
experimentation type books, this is the only one that I've kept.
Yeah.
Because I found the other experimentation books took me down the wrong paths. They were too number focused. There's too
Yeah.
many graphs. Whereas this one looks at hypothesis, it looks at chance and
Mhm.
luck, observation, um, the nuances through the entire scientific process, not just this
Yeah.
single path, but taking advantage of things that happen.
Mm. I think that I remember it was, I think it was a What's It. So it was a peer conference in the States where we were trying to talk about experiments. And because I had a physics background, people thought I'd know what I was doing with experiments. I'm not sure that I do, because an awful lot of science is demonstrating that something that is known is still known. And that involves generally wiggling things that you expect and wiggling things that you know and looking for things you expect. And there's another branch of science which is not normal science, and that involves finding out what you can wiggle. And then because you've looked at what happens and you go, well, how does that work? How does that function? And you're kind of taught about that science when you're at school because, what could make this go down the slope faster? Put more weight on it, make the wheels sticky, drag it with a spring, throw it away. There's a bunch of things you can do. Excuse me, I just lost an elbow. There's a bunch of things you can do, and you try them and you see what on earth happens. But a lot of science is knowing that. So yeah, books on experimentation are typically books on things like the pairwise stuff. We're trying to get as much information as you can from as a cheaper set of experiments as possible, the effectiveness of an experiment, and about demonstrating things so that you're not introducing other forms of variation. And yet, things like controls. And
Yep.
yet, what we're looking at, because we're looking for trouble, is very often actually looking for those variations, looking for what we've got that has affected something else. And that's not normal science anymore. That's proper discovery, which is one of the reasons that having trained, I put the word, use the word loosely, as a physicist, I found software experimentation much more interesting because it was always a whole new universe.
Yeah, see, I was always on the table at school where it was, so how do we make this explode? And
Yeah.
we had no idea why it would do that or what we were doing, but as long as we got the result, it was fine.
We were, I mean, at school and indeed at university, both of the physics things I did were very practical based. Thankfully, university had 2 days in lab per week. Otherwise, I would have failed even more spectacularly than I nearly failed otherwise. But yeah, you basically get given the equipment, you get given a theory, you get given some things to play with, and they're usually limited in some way or other. And you see what happens. And the world is always a bit more non-linear than the theory would predict until you get to the really, really etiolated stuff. And that's actually that's where it's interesting. It's interesting to look at how a wire stretches. It's particularly interesting to look at how a wire breaks. Looking at how a wire stretches, it does this, does this, does this. Well, when it breaks, makes a spong noise and it falls on your foot. Oh, that's interesting. And but also you look at the wire and it's thinned down. It's got this crackly bit at the very end where it goes. The act of stretching it is much less interesting than the act of breaking it and seeing what's happened. Why did that go from being stretched to break? Why does elastic go very long? What all these things that are true that are slightly outside the experiment. So yeah, we can. Let's not do testing like we're at school.
Well, I don't know. I still test like, how can I make this blow up? That's one of the things that drives me. Because if I can really get to that point, then you can work backwards and go, all right, what are the steps? What are the simple things you need to
Yeah,
do? But if someone is ignoring what you're telling them, push it harder and harder until they can't ignore it any further.
I had a colleague who was a test manager who sat in a room and said, "We can entirely empty the physical thing that was the heart of the business with this collection of things that we've done. We know it, we can do it, and if it happens in live, it will empty the physical thing, leaving us with nothing. Shall we test it some more?" But it was lovely. Had they knew that it was possible, and then they had to make it plausible. And sometimes what we're doing, and you and I
Yeah.
both, I think, from having worked with you, is we're finding out what is possible, and then the experiments then go, this is true. It can do this. It will reveal this information, or it will throw this information away. It will come to this wrong conclusion. How can we get there so easily that this is now an irrefutable, not irrefutable, irrefutable is one part of it, an unignorable problem. So there is a bit of sales and marketing in there ultimately, but I think what we're looking at with the experiments isn't, well, some of them are what happens, and others of them are how can we refine this so that we know firstly why it's happening, but secondly, what's really important about this? Is this a little problem because it's rare? Is this a big problem because actually it's got knock-on effects, or a big problem because it's much less rare than we imagine? Fun to do.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things I find is because I've been doing so much development work,
Hmm.
um, and you're much, much closer to the code, I still think in those terms, like what could go
Mhm.
wrong, how could it go wrong? But I don't have to explore it in those terms or demonstrate it that way because I know where in the code it's vulnerable.
Yeah.
So I know the isolation point, and I could just say, well, what happens if X happens? And then we'll go, well, let's protect against that by doing this, and then we'll introduce a new
Mhm.
state. So it's a tiny, tiny fix for if I was having to approach it from the outside as a tester, it could take ages
Yeah.
and be very, very hard to recreate. So it's interesting being on both sides of the fence, I think.
Hmm. Well, do you remember we did a thing once where I think it was possibly the only useful bug I found was one of the regexes was wrong in a piece of code for a place we were both working. And rather than having, we found that by searching, but not for regexes. We found out by searching behaviors, and then that was easy. We just went, okay, let's just have all the regexes out and look for the same problem. And yeah, knowing that you can go from one to the other, I think is very powerful. And that's one of the reasons that I think that testers should be able to at least understand code, is that you can drop into your systems in an entirely different way, and you have a whole different set of strengths for demonstrating these things and for finding these things.
Yep.
Yeah.
So one of the things when we were talking before, I mentioned that I thought testing was easier to practice than development. And then I thought, right, I'm going to challenge that assumption. So I started to look at leak code, all the exercises that people use in interviews. So I was looking at leakcode.com, and they've got all these little exercises that you're supposed to do. And the code that you're supposed to write is very small.
Hmm.
And if you use their internal IDE, you don't have to set up any software. But I think their internal IDE is dreadful. So if you've got a practice sample software and you can write unit tests in it, you can write these little chunks of code, you paste it into their system, and they give you 3 or 4 examples. But once you submit it, it runs against 1,000 other examples to see. And so you get this huge scope of tests that you would never create for your code.
Okay.
And I find it quite interesting because I have always looked at that and gone, yeah, that's useless. That doesn't teach you how to code properly. It doesn't teach you how to program. But what it does do is it gives you some familiarity with the constructs and thinking about it in a small space. But what I found is you can also look at other people's solutions. And so I'm looking at my solution in comparison to other people's. And it's like, okay, well, all these other ones would not pass a PR or be allowed in commercial code whatsoever, because they don't have proper variable names. They haven't split it down into readable chunks, but it's probably super fast. But I've optimized for maintainability, readability, understandability when you look through it. There's different sets of skills. So it's possible to use even these other leak code type sites to practice in a different way. So I'm practicing, can I approach it like a normal development problem, not an algorithm problem. So I've no idea what algorithm I'm using. I'm not taking an off-shelf algorithm implementing it. I'm just writing something that will solve the problem. So it's interesting. Sorry, because I always thought testing was a lot easier to practice, but there are things out there that make it easier to practice development than I had anticipated.
I find it hard to draw a line between testing and development in terms of, is one easier to practice or one more difficult to practice?
So I make a distinction between development and programming. So, because for me, development is the entire space.
Yeah, it's the big
including
one.
Testing, designing, all of that stuff. Programming is the writing of code.
Yes, programming is the things that actually the LLMs do typing quite well. But yeah, the I've always considered myself a developer. I am a tester, and frankly, I'm a systems analyst. But those are part of being a developer. I develop things. We go from idea into something that's more real than just an idea. We develop something into a reality of sorts. Sometimes that reality is code, sometimes it's data, sometimes it's process and procedure with tools around it. It's all sorts of things, but that's what a developer is. And I'm a developer. But as a development goes, I focus on the trouble that we can have and how to find it, and how to find it faster and more relevantly and in a way that convinces people better, but still a developer. But yeah, if you're looking for jobs, clearly you go, oh no, I'm QA. I can assure quality until it comes out my ears.
Yeah, I've never been a QA. That's the thing. So I'm conscious of time because I have to be the person that monitors the time.
Yeah.
So
and we're coming to
we only have about 3 or 4 minutes left.
Yeah.
So before we head off, are there any tips for practicing?
Well, it's the Nike slogan is just do it. I'm not convinced that doing the kata style practice, where you do the same thing over and over again, is worth it in our varied world. I think it can teach you an awful lot about one area, but I think it's more interesting to me to go into something that is pretty close to the real world and to think, I'm still going to do this as if I'm practicing. I'm still going to think about what I'm doing and not care too much if it goes wrong and not care too much if it goes right, because I have to learn about not just the thing I'm working with as a tester, but about how I'm working as a tester. So that would be my sense of how practice works, is that practice is pretty much always on, apart from maybe those times when you've got to do something very fast, or where you've got to perform it, or where you've got many other things going on other than I've just got to get to be a better tester and understand this better. And I think testing often leads to that. So practicing, I think, is best done with real stuff, in real places, in real ways. Exercises are all very well, particularly neat ones that kind of fillet you into some mindset, which is where I try to live. But no, practicing has to be real. How about you?
Um, so I kind of agree with that, and I do see some value in cat now that I've done leak code. I see some value in the cat style, but it's about approaching it in a different way each time, like choosing what you are going to practice and apply it to that particular situation. But the biggest thing for me is you have to make notes. I've got a stack of, I don't know
Yeah.
if they're behind me, a set of cassette tapes that I found in the attic from previous practice sessions when I was learning guitar. Because you can go back and you can see what you did well, what was bad that you need to try and improve, what you did well, and you go, I have no idea how I even did that. And you can try and reverse engineer it into something that you can repeat. But that ability to take notes, and taking notes and recording stuff also requires practicing. So you need to spend
Yeah.
practice sessions aimed at developing that skill that allows you to support your ongoing practicing.
You need to practice how to practice.
Yes, you do, sadly. All right. Well, thanks for that, because I know that
Thank you.
we're going to run out of time.
Yeah.
So I will try and summarize things at some point. But you can find James at workroom-productions.com.
Right.
And there's links to the exercises that you mentioned,
There are
because they're all
lots of
free,
links. Yep.
and the
Yep.
black box things, and there's videos and a whole ton of stuff. So
Yep.
let's end it there and just say thank you, James.
Thank you, Alan. Been lovely being here.
And that was me, Alan Richardson, in conversation with Mr. James Lyndsay from workroom-productions.com. If you liked this episode, remember to like and subscribe. And if you didn't, remember to like and subscribe anyway. We'll have links to James's website and other resources mentioned here in the show notes and in the description on the video. Thanks very much for tuning in, and see you next time.